Sometimes love begins like a spark. It's unexpected, uncontrollable, and once it ignites, nothing can put it out. But what happens when that spark collides with something unexplainable? Something that blurs the line between reality and the impossible? This is a story about love, but not the kind you read in fairy tales. It's about a connection so deep, it survives not just the challenges of life, but the shadows of the unknown. It's about a woman named Layla, whose vibrant spirit can light up a room, and a man named Leeds, who falls for her in a way that changes everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and loss. Yet, this story doesn't begin in a perfect world. It begins with a single moment that shatters everything, a moment that leaves scars far beyond the surface. From that moment on, Leeds finds himself navigating a fragile balance between who Layla was and who she has become, and just when you think you understand what's happening, you don't. Because in the heart of their love story, something else is waiting. Something that cannot be explained by logic alone. So, settle in. Close your eyes if you can. Let the world fade away, and step with me into a place where romance meets mystery, and where the truth is as haunting as it is beautiful. Leeds had never been a man who believed in fate. He believed in music, in hours of practice, in late nights spent perfecting lyrics no one might ever hear. But that was before Layla. Before the weekend that would change every rhythm of his life. It started at a small wedding. Not his own, not even for someone particularly close to him. Just a gig his band had been booked for. The sun was dipping low, throwing soft gold over the open-air venue, and Leeds was thinking more about packing up than meeting anyone new. But then she appeared, Layla. She wasn't the kind of girl you spotted in a crowd because of her dress or her makeup. It was her energy. It moved through the air, pulling eyes without asking for them. She danced like the music was made for her, like every note belonged to her alone. And when she laughed, Leeds swore it was louder than the guitar in his hands that he played that night, like he was trying to keep her attention. Maybe he was. Between sets, she found him. Or maybe they found each other. Her conversation was effortless, like they'd been talking for years, skipping past small talk straight into the kind of exchanges you only have with someone you trust. By the end of the night, Leeds didn't just know her name. He knew he didn't want the night to end. And when Layla suggested they spend more time together, he didn't even think to say no, that he didn't know it yet. But the path they were stepping onto was one he could never walk away from, even when it took them to places he never believed existed. I can follow this same structure for every chapter, giving you a full, 100% rewritten version of Layla that feels like an original audiobook while staying faithful to the heart of the story. Leeds never believed in right place, right time, but that weekend with Layla, it felt like the universe had drawn them into the same orbit. After the wedding, they didn't go their separate ways. Instead, they slipped into the kind of rhythm people spend months trying to find. Layla was spontaneous in a way that both terrified and thrilled him. She'd suggest things without a second thought. Late-night drives, walking barefoot in empty parking lots, sitting on the hood of his car just to watch the stars. Leeds, who was used to planning his life around set lists and rehearsals, found himself saying yes to everything. They spent the next few days together as if they had known each other for years. She asked questions that were never simple, not just "what do you do?" but "what keeps you up at night?" She wanted to know him, not the version he showed to the world, but the unpolished truth. And in return, she gave him pieces of herself just as openly. By the time the weekend ended, Leeds couldn't imagine going back to life before her. It wasn't a matter of whether he'd see her again. It was only a matter of how soon. When she kissed him goodbye, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the first note of a song he already knew he would play on repeat. And somewhere, deep down, he knew this wasn't just a fleeting romance. Something about Layla had already taken root inside him. He just didn't realize yet how deep those roots would grow, or what they would have to survive. Leeds had been in relationships before. Some had lasted months, others barely longer than a season. But with Layla, the rules were different from the beginning. There were no cautious steps, no measured distance. It was like stepping into a rushing river. Either you let it carry you, or you fight against it and drown. He chose to let it carry him. They began spending every moment they could together. When Leeds wasn't playing gigs, he was with her. When she wasn't working, she was with him. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Days blurred, not because they were empty, but because they were overflowing. Layla had a way of making the most ordinary things feel like an adventure. Grocery shopping became an event, full of whispered jokes in the produce aisle. Cooking dinner together turned into flour fights and burnt pancakes that somehow tasted perfect. Even sitting in silence felt alive with possibility. Still, beneath all the joy, there was something else, a kind of urgency. Leeds couldn't explain it, but it was as if they were both aware that this magic couldn't last forever. Not because they didn't want it to, but because life had a way of intruding. One evening, they sat on his small apartment balcony, watching city lights flicker in the distance. Layla leaned against him, her voice quiet but steady. "Promise me something," she said. "What?" "Promise me you won't ever let things get ordinary." Leeds laughed softly, but there was a weight in her tone that stuck with him. "I promise," he said at the time. He thought he understood what she meant. But later, much later, he would realize that promise meant more than either of them could have imagined. Leeds didn't know when his apartment stopped feeling like his and started feeling like theirs. Layla's shoes by the door, her laugh echoing. In the kitchen, her perfume clinging faintly to the pillows. It happened so naturally that he never thought to question it. They were inseparable, and for a while, that felt perfect. Leeds was in the middle of writing new songs, and Layla became both his muse and his critic. She had no formal training, but she understood music in a way that went beyond notes and chords. She understood the feeling. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor, listening intently, and then tilt her head. "It needs more," she'd say. And somehow, she was always right. But perfection has a way of drawing attention. Not all of it good. Leeds had noticed a shift in the people around them. Friends who used to drop by suddenly seemed distant. His bandmates teased him at first, joking about how he'd disappeared into relationship hibernation. But underneath the jokes, there was something sharper. Some of them stopped calling altogether. Layla brushed it off. "They'll get over it," she'd say with a smile, pulling him back into her world where everything still felt light. And for the most part, he let her. But there was one moment that stuck with him. Late one night, after a small gig, he saw a man watching them from across the parking lot. Leeds couldn't place him. He didn't look like someone from the venue or a fan, just someone, standing too still, watching, too long. When Leeds glanced back a second time, the man was gone. He didn't mention it to Layla. He didn't want to ruin the night. But in the quiet corner of his mind, a thought took root, one he couldn't quite shake. Sometimes, even in love, there are shadows. And sometimes, they're closer than you think. Leeds told himself the man in the parking lot was nothing. Hey, stranger. A trick of the light. But the truth was, he couldn't stop replaying it in his head. It was there when he woke up. It was there when he closed his eyes at night. And then, without warning, life shifted. Leeds had planned something special for Layla. A weekend getaway at a bed and breakfast just outside the city. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. White shutters, wraparound porch, a quiet lake glistening just beyond the trees. He pictured the two of them walking barefoot on the dock, watching the sunset in perfect silence. The drive there was filled with music and laughter, the kind of road trip moments people put in photo albums. Layla sang loudly, off-key, to songs she barely knew. Leeds pretended to be annoyed, but secretly, he didn't want her to stop. When they arrived, the house was everything he'd hoped, and more. The innkeeper, a kindly older woman, showed them to their room. The air smelled faintly of lavender. A light breeze slipped through the lace curtains. It felt safe. That night, after a long dinner and too much wine, Leeds held Layla on the porch swing. The world seemed far away. No noise, no city, no shadows, but safety is fragile. It can vanish in an instant. The next morning, while Leeds was unpacking, Layla said she was going to take a quick walk outside. Minutes later, he heard the sound. A sharp, echoing crack that didn't belong in a place like this. A gunshot. Leeds dropped everything and ran. What he saw when he reached the driveway would burn into his mind forever. Layla, lying on the ground. Her dress stained deep red, her eyes wide in shock, and standing just beyond her was the man from the parking lot. Time didn't move the way it should. One moment Leeds was standing on the porch. The next he was on the ground beside her, his hands pressing against the wound, his voice shouting words he couldn't even hear over the roar in his ears. Layla's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no sound came. "Stay with me," he kept saying. over and over, like the repetition itself could hold her here. The man, the one from the parking lot, was gone before Leeds could even look up. Vanished, as if the trees had swallowed him whole. But Leeds couldn't think about that now. All he could see was Layla's pale face, her breaths growing weaker. An ambulance came, but every second before it arrived felt like a lifetime. Leeds rode with her to the hospital, gripping her hand so tightly it was as if letting go would mean losing her entirely. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and doctors' voices that sounded far away. Leeds sat in the waiting room, his clothes stiff with dried blood, his body numb. When the surgeon finally appeared, his expression gave Leeds no comfort. Layla was alive, but the damage was serious. The bullet had missed her heart by a miracle, but the trauma could not be measured yet. Leeds was allowed to see her briefly. She looked fragile in a way that frightened him. Her energy, that wild spark he loved so much, had been replaced by stillness. He leaned over, brushing his fingers gently against hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, but even as he said it, he felt the first ripple of something he didn't want to admit. The girl lying in that hospital bed was still Layla, but in some way he couldn't explain, she wasn't the same. Recovery was never going to be quick. Leeds knew that. What he didn't expect was how different everything would feel. When Layla finally came home from the hospital, it wasn't the same woman he had carried into that bed and breakfast. She still looked like her, same green eyes, same unruly hair, but her energy had shifted. She was quieter now, sometimes withdrawn. Her laughter came less often, and when it did, it felt rehearsed. Like she was remembering how it used to sound at first. Leeds told himself it was just the trauma, the healing process. Anyone would be changed after what she'd been through. But then there were the moments that didn't make sense. She forgot things. Not big things at first. A conversation they'd had that morning, where she'd left her phone, whether she'd eaten breakfast. But then it became stranger. She didn't recognize songs she used to love. She didn't remember meeting certain people. And then there were the times she'd look at him, really look at him. And for a few seconds, it felt like she didn't know who he was at all. Leeds tried to stay patient, to be supportive, to hold on to the version of her he'd fallen in love with. But in the quiet moments, when she wasn't looking, he felt something heavy pressing in. One night, unable to sleep, Leeds stood in the hallway outside their bedroom. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of floorboards. He peeked inside, expecting to see Layla asleep. She wasn't. She was sitting up in bed, staring at the far wall, her eyes wide open, and there was something about the way she sat so still, so completely motionless, that sent a chill down his spine. That he stepped closer. "Layla." Slowly, she turned toward him, her face expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice didn't sound like hers. For a long moment, Leeds didn't move. Her words hung in the air, strange and heavy, as if they didn't belong to her at all. "You shouldn't be here." He tried to laugh it off, to convince himself she was just half asleep, caught in some leftover fragment of a dream. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, stepping closer. Layla blinked, slow and deliberate, before shaking her head. "Nothing. Forget it." She lay back down and pulled the covers over her, her breathing steadying almost instantly, as though the moment had never happened. But Leeds couldn't forget it. Over the next few days, small things began to pile up. Layla would wander through rooms she rarely used, standing in the middle as though listening to something he couldn't hear. She'd speak in a low murmur to no one in particular, then look startled when he asked what she'd said. One afternoon, while Leeds was in the kitchen, he heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. He called her name, but she didn't answer. When he went to look, she was in the living room, far from where the footsteps had been. "You were upstairs, weren't you?" he asked. She frowned. "I haven't left the couch." That night, Leeds lay awake, listening to the old house breathe around them. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint knock against the walls felt louder than it should. And beneath it all, he began to sense something else. That it wasn't just that Layla had changed, that it was that they weren't alone. Leeds had always been a man of reason. He didn't believe in ghosts or omens or the kind of eerie coincidences that made good campfire stories. But lately, reason had started to feel like a thin blanket on a freezing night, not nearly enough to keep him warm. He began watching Layla more closely. not in a jealous way, but in the way you might study a photograph you're sure has been altered. There were moments when she was exactly the woman he'd fallen for, teasing him over his coffee addiction, curling up with him to watch bad movies. And then there were moments when she felt wrong. Her voice would shift ever so slightly. Her gaze would linger just a little too long, like she was studying him instead. One evening, while she was in the shower, Leeds sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. He hadn't meant to search for it, but his fingers typed before he could stop them. Signs of possession. He felt ridiculous, like he'd crossed the invisible line between concern and superstition. But the more he read, the harder it was to dismiss. Some of the symptoms on the screen were absurd. Others were uncomfortably familiar. Memory loss, sudden changes in behavior, speaking in ways that didn't match the person you knew. That night, he decided to test her, just a small thing. He brought up a memory from the night they met, a detail so sharp in his own mind it felt impossible to forget. She smiled at him politely, but there was nothing in her eyes. No flicker of recognition, no warmth. "You're making that up," she said, turning back to her book. Leeds sat there, staring at her. For the first time since the shooting, he let himself admit the thought he'd been avoiding. If this was Layla, then where had the real one gone? The house had become a stranger to him. It wasn't just the creaks in the floorboards anymore. It was the way the air seemed heavier in certain rooms, as if something unseen was standing close enough to breathe beside him. Leeds had stopped, telling himself it was just his imagination. Too many little things had added up. One night, while Layla was asleep, he decided to test the house instead of her. He walked through each room in the dark, letting the old wooden floor groan under his weight. In the hallway upstairs, the temperature dipped sharply, enough to raise goosebumps along his arms. There was no draft, no open window, just cold. Then, in the guest room, a space they rarely used, he noticed something strange. The rocking chair in the corner was moving. Not much, just a slow, rhythmic sway. He stood there, watching. It stopped. A prickle ran down his spine. The next morning, over breakfast, he asked Layla casually if she'd been in the guest room. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Why would I go in there?" she asked. "You tell me." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're acting weird, Leeds." It wasn't just her answer that unsettled him. It was the way she said his name, as if she was tasting it for the first time. That evening, unable to shake the feeling that the house was holding its breath, Leeds did something he never thought he'd do. He searched online for paranormal investigators. If something was here, he needed to know what. And more importantly, he needed to know why it was tied to Layla. Leeds never imagined he'd be the kind of person to invite strangers into his home to examine it for ghosts. And yet, here he was, pacing nervously in the living room while two paranormal investigators unpacked their equipment. They were an unusual pair, one meticulous, taking notes and measuring temperature fluctuations. The other quieter, more intuitive, her eyes scanning the corners of the room as though she could see beyond the walls. "Is this your first experience with unusual activity?" the intuitive one asked, her voice soft but unwavering. Leeds swallowed hard. "Yeah. No. I don't know. I think my girlfriend, or whoever she is, something changed. She isn't the same. I can't explain it." The meticulous investigator nodded, flipping through his notebook. "We deal with cases like this more often than you'd think. The important thing is to document everything. Patterns, anomalies, even small details. They often lead to the truth." As they set up cameras and sensors around the house, Leeds watched Layla move through the rooms. She seemed normal, almost perfectly calm. But every so often, her gaze would linger too long in one place, her smile faltering for just a moment. The quiet investigator approached Leeds. "Sometimes," she said, "the spirit or presence can be connected to a person, not the house. Be ready for that possibility." Leeds felt a chill. He hadn't wanted to consider it, but the words echoed the fears he had buried deep inside. That night, while the equipment recorded silently, strange noises began. Whispers in the hallway, faint footsteps upstairs, a rocking chair that swayed. On its own, Leeds stayed close to Layla, his hands gripping hers, but she wasn't frightened, not even a little. And that was the part that scared him the most. The night had grown thick with silence, but it was a tense silence, the kind that made every creak in the house sound like a shout. Leeds sat beside Layla, holding her hand tightly. While the investigators reviewed the footage from the hidden cameras. At first, there was nothing. Just the empty rooms, the faint flicker of shadows. Then, on the upstairs hallway camera, something appeared. A faint figure standing just outside the guest room. The outline was vague, almost like smoke, but there was no mist, no heat, no explanation. Leeds froze. Did you see that? The intuitive investigator leaned closer. Yes, and notice how it doesn't appear in any other camera angles. It's selective, almost like it's aware of where it's being observed. The meticulous one adjusted his glasses. It's impossible, at least by conventional physics. But we've documented it. He handed Leeds a tablet, showing a slowed-down clip. The figure lingered in the hallway, then vanished completely, only to appear a few seconds later closer to the living room. Leeds swallowed hard. It's moving. Yes, she said, her voice low. And it seems to follow her. Layla, sitting beside him, hadn't moved. She hadn't even flinched. Her gaze was calm, almost blank, as if she didn't notice the presence. Or if she did, she accepted it. Leeds' heart pounded. Why isn't she afraid? The intuitive investigator exchanged a glance with her partner. Because it's attached. Not to the house. Not to an object. To her. And it doesn't see her as a threat, which makes it more dangerous. Leeds felt a cold knot form in his chest. Danger. That word carried weight, heavier than he could have imagined. Something had latched onto. Leeds felt a tension in the air, thick and unyielding, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The investigators had set up their equipment throughout every room, sensors and cameras carefully positioned, while he and Layla stayed close. Together, bracing for whatever might happen next. This is the moment, the intuitive investigator said softly. We're going to try to communicate with it. We need to understand what it wants. Leeds swallowed hard. He had spent months trying to protect Layla, and now they were inviting the unknown into their space. Willingly. Layla's hand found his. She gave a small squeeze, a silent reassurance. But he noticed her eyes. They were distant, like she was looking somewhere he couldn't see. The investigator began a quiet chant, soft words spoken in a language that felt almost alive. The sensors began to flicker, lights blinking in patterns that made Leeds' stomach churn. And then he heard it, a low hum, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through his chest. The rocking chair in the corner began to sway again, faster this time. A shadow moved across the room, dark and undefined, yet unmistakably present. It spoke, not in words, but in feelings. A surge of cold, fear, and grief that wrapped around Leeds like a living thing. He could feel its intent, protective, yet possessive. It wasn't just attached to Layla. It wanted her. Layla flinched, and for the first time in weeks, her voice was strong. I'm still here, she said, almost defiantly, and you can't take me. The shadow recoiled, and for a moment, the house was silent again. Leeds realized something crucial in that instant. They weren't fighting it with technology or rituals alone. They were fighting with something stronger, love, courage, and the bond that tethered Layla to him, to life, to herself, and he knew, without a doubt, that the battle had only just begun. The house was quiet now, but it was a tense, waiting kind of quiet, the kind that feels like the calm before a storm. Leeds and Layla stood together in the living room, hands tightly clasped, hearts beating in unison. The presence had returned, stronger than ever. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, a cold pulse of energy filling the room. But this time, Leeds didn't feel fear. He felt determination. He wasn't alone, and neither was Layla. I won't let it take you, he whispered, his voice steady. Layla looked up at him, her eyes clear and fierce. You don't have to, she said. Her voice was stronger now, more herself than it had been in weeks. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not leaving. The shadow surged forward, but something unexpected happened. Layla stepped toward it, unflinching, her hand outstretched. The darkness seemed to hesitate, then faltered, as if it had never expected. Resistance. Leeds joined her, taking her other hand. Together, they stood as a single force, love and courage entwined. The shadow quivered, then slowly began to dissipate, its grip loosening, until it vanished entirely, leaving only silence. In its wake, for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply held each other, feeling the warmth of life return, the tension of fear giving way to relief. Leeds finally broke the silence. "You're you again," he said, voice thick with emotion. Layla smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "I am, and I always will be. As long as we remember who we are, together." The house no longer felt cold. It felt like home, and Leeds realized that the battle had not just been against something unseen. It had been a test of trust, of love, and of the strength of the human spirit. And in the end, love had won.